Thank you very much for being here this late on the last day, on the Saturday. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, so hopefully I can get that across a little bit. Although it may also be the session with the longest title. Apologies. I take suggestions how to shorten that. So just a little bit about myself, and then we get right into the topic. Matthias Thierbach. I'm running a data management and BI team at YouGov in London, and it's that experience in particular which I'm talking about here. Been a data platform MVP for a couple of months now, and been quite active in the Power BI community, specifically around source control and open source and CI/CD topics. There's a tool called PBI Tools, which you may have heard of. That's something I've been working on for quite a few years. Okay, so this session is not a technical session, or at least it's not intended to be. The session is meant to be almost a download of learnings, best practices, insights I've accumulated over quite a few years, specifically with respect to Power BI model development, but also with respect to what's the organizational context? What's the team context that makes it all work or doesn't, right? This is all coming from my very own experience of basically coming into the Power BI space around 2016, 2017. I was a one-man show originally in my company when the CFO decided they needed some reporting. Obviously, there was lots of Excel stuff and SharePoint stuff in the beginning. Then Power BI became a thing. I made a bet on it, and I've never looked back. And so things grew. And so now I'm in a position where I'm actually running a pretty sizable team, because some stuff worked out quite nicely. People enjoyed what they were getting in terms of Power BI reports, so they wanted more. And for me, that was not an easy journey. There were lots of learnings, organizationally, but also engineering-wise, to actually make all of this work and scale. So that's what I want to talk about. So looking at the agenda, the second and third items are quite crucial here. Explicitly making a distinction between the delivery side, or PM, or whatever you want to call it, and the engineering side. And I want to cover both of that. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this session, it's that precise insight, right? Being successful with Power BI and being able to successfully deliver what business needs out of Power BI is not primarily an engineering problem. And I think that is also not something that is being covered a lot, so that's why I'm quite keen. But it is an engineering problem as well, which is why it's on the agenda too, right? So basically, you got to get both things right. To make this not too generic and super wide, we're specifically looking into model development here. And a few assumptions I'm making here are, first of all, we're talking about enterprise models, centralized enterprise models, right? We're not talking about, tiny PBIX models that someone builds up just because, you want to visualize some data from an Excel file. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, with respect to engineering and tooling, I'm assuming PBI Premium and having access to XMLA endpoints. Just putting it out here. A lot of the practices I'm talking about obviously do apply when you're in a Power BI Pro context, but if you want to go all the way, there's no way around XMLA endpoint, which in a Power BI world means premium. Okay, so let's do a little question and answer game here. Those are some challenges I see and I've come across over the years. And again, I'm making this distinction, delivery side on the one end, engineering on the other. Show of hands, who can relate to those, right? So with respect to delivering, getting clear and accurate specs. Yeah, very good. Being able to continuously deliver in the sense that the business actually thinks they're continuously getting value from you. Delivery on time. And, well, quality. Are things right? On the engineering side, there are quite a few challenges too. Pro tooling. There were some announcements yesterday, which I'm going to cover briefly as well. So there's the last time I did this talk, things were much worse than they are today. But also, how do we collaborate on Power BI desktop projects? Right? I mean, it's still a real-world problem, right? How do we effectively develop and debug DAX measures? Also, last time I was publicly talking about this, tooling was not as great as it's today. And then a few smaller things, for instance, deciding what to put into Power Query as opposed to what to actually keep as a native query. Refresh times is something I've been spending a lot of sort of time and brainstorming on. Keeping track of changes and versions, and knowing what's actually in production, right? So I'm sort of thinking, having folders here, V1, V2, V25, of, I don't know, Excel, PBX files, which one is out there, right? So those are some common challenges, which I hope lots of you can relate to. But let's look into the PM side, into the delivery side. So this is something I want to talk about, and mostly for everyone to get some more awareness around certain concepts. So from my point of view, it's actually quite important to understand for any BI project, frankly, has nothing to do with Power BI. They are genuinely different roles that we need to that we simply have, right? And it's about considering that and being aware. And I'm not talking roles in terms of FTEs. I'm not talking necessarily, there's someone with a specific job, but I'm talking in terms of this whole space between the BI team and the business and everything that needs to be delivered. They are genuinely different roles that usually not a single person can take up. So having a product manager is something which has worked really well for me, and which I definitely want to make a point of. Again, the starting point here was we're working with centralized enterprise models. So the model I've established over the years is to actually think of our models as products. And this is a concept that's going to come up over and over again. And so there's a product manager there. And we're actually thinking about what's the value we're delivering to the business with respect to that model, who are the stakeholders using the model, and what do we need to do around gathering requirements and also prioritizing what we're working on. And that may not be something that you have traditionally in a BI team, which is why I'm mentioning it here. But it's also really important to have a dedicated business owner there to represent, to be really close to the BI team and to basically represent your key stakeholders and to be there for any questions around business requirements, right? Oftentimes, and in my own experience as well, that is one of the big problems. BI projects, Power BI projects cannot be IT projects, right? Ultimately, what we're doing, I mean, as much fun as it is, to geek out and to talk, deeply technical things with respect to Power BI and tabular modeling and not. At the end of the day, our entire industry only exists because we're delivering, or we're supposed to deliver insights, right? And those are generally insights to a non-technical person. And it's oftentimes forgotten, particularly in spaces like this, where everything is sort of quite a bubble, right? And super geeky and very technical. So don't, remind yourself every single day when you get to work that, that's the ultimate purpose why we're doing that. It still means we can geek out, and I love that more than anyone, but that's not the ultimate purpose here. I'm not going to go through every single row here. The key takeaway really is think about there are different types of personas, different types of roles involved here. My specific practices, which I've developed over the years on the delivery side, are a versioning system, and we'll come into this in a second. So basically, even when it comes to models, even when it comes to Power BI data sets, putting a tag, putting a version number on a particular point in your continuous delivery timeline is really important. And then being able to understand what's in that version and what comes in the next version or what was in the previous version. Also taking advantage of very powerful issue trackers and DevOps systems which are out there and which are easily accessible to all of us. So the model we've developed is using an issue tracker to maintain business specs and the backlog, linking that to a source control system where all our Power BI artifacts are, and then basically have a single system where we go from business requirements on the one end all the way to the deployment and the delivery on the other end. And everything is integrated around the concept of a particular version with certain features in it, the version going through different stages in terms of QA and approval, and ultimately anyone using the data set being able to see what version they're actually connected to. And so that's the DevOps side of things. And again, even the non-technical delivery person, the PM here, has to get involved in terms of putting their business specs in. And then the other thing that's worked really well for me is agreeing upfront about the scope of a particular release. And again, this is where versioning comes in, right? If you're saying this month, as an example, I'm planning to release the next iteration of my enterprise model, and that happens to be version, I don't know, 2.6, right? Then a model that we're working with quite successfully is to then basically sit down, before we start that particular sprint, and spell out very explicitly what's going to ship in 2.6. And then everything in that sprint is all about delivering that particular milestone. It means that the engineers, the PMs, and ultimately the business stakeholders all speak the same language, because they can all communicate now on what we've discussed as the 2.6, right? For instance, do we need to ship a bunch of new measures? Do we need to ship a bunch of new columns that need to be exposed from one of our source systems? So basically this milestone-based delivery model, which contains both the business side as well as the engineers, has worked really well for me. In my particular case, in my team, we generally use months as a unit of delivery here. But that's, you can make an arbitrary choice there. Month works quite well for me. It's long enough for you to be able to do something significant, but it's also short enough for you to actually to be able to see already, where you're going to be by the end of that sprint, and for you to keep up the momentum with the business, for instance. All right. So one other reference I wanted to give is the DataOps manifesto. Who's heard of the DataOps manifesto? Very good. I don't. John. Very good that you're here. Last time I presented that, I mentioned your name, and but you weren't actually there, I think. So that's. I'm not going to even go to that link right now. I'm not going to read this out because it's a pretty substantial document. But that is something you need to be aware of. It's I document, I think, of 28 or so points which point out particular challenges with respect to data, with respect to delivering data projects and BI projects, and help enormously in terms of understanding, what's the wider context here, and also pointing out a few best practices and patterns in terms of addressing those problems. And John's blog is a fantastic resource, because he's written a long series of blog posts, basically looking at the DataOps manifesto in particular, and giving a very good write-up with respect to how that relates to Power BI. So can absolutely recommend it. There's also a history here. I'm just going to make a brief note of that. The origin of that is the Azure manifesto. Is anyone aware of Azure manifesto? That was a big deal when I was much younger. I think came about in the early noughties, if I remember correctly, maybe even earlier than that. And back then, it was a community effort of some people who had discovered or identified a problem with respect to delivering software. They basically saw this as a general issue, and spelled out a few principles saying we're no longer focused on the business value we're supposed to be bringing here. We've gotten very hung up on technical, internal engineering problems, which ultimately lead to the inability to deliver frequently and reliably. And so the Agile Manifesto was quite a big deal in the engineering and software world in particular, and made a big impact. Agile development principles actually came exactly out of that. And so today, just stepping away from Power BI specifically, it feels like in the data world and in the BI world, we're at a similar waypoint where the industry, the wider industry needs to actually come to that insight and to that realization that new practices, new ways of delivering projects are necessary for us to be able to actually address what our ultimate stakeholders need. So that really is the wider context where the DataOps manifesto is coming from. But I'll leave it there. Have a look at that offline, and I hope you can get some good inspiration out of it. So let's come back to something more specific. Versioning. I've mentioned that already. A concept I'm very keen for you to be aware of and to take home is semantic versioning. Anyone heard of semantic versioning? Okay, good. A few, but not everyone, so that's going to change this afternoon. Semantic versioning is something I'm personally very passionate about because it just makes sense. And it works really well, and it does apply to BI projects. So, in my team, both for models as well as for reports, we consistently and strictly use semantic versioning. What is it? If you think of version numbers, and we've got a few examples down there, in a very just thinking very intuitively about versions, right? Obviously, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's usually how files in SharePoint systems are versioned, right? That doesn't get you very far, particularly if you can't even define, what a particular version is meant to contain. So, if we want to be slightly more scientific about that, we come up with versions and subversions, and 1.0.0 is an example, 1.2.1 is an example. What semantic versioning does is it gives us a very specific definition of how to actually come up with a version number for something. And it says that we always have three elements in a version number, like here, 1, 2, 1, it would be an example. And those three elements have a particular meaning. Those are the major, minor, and patch version. And semantic versioning defines very precisely, almost like a legal document, what a change in major version as opposed to a change in the minor version means. Again, that applies to software, that applies to documents, that applies to reports, that applies to models, in my view at least. So coming back to models here, what is a breaking change in a model? A breaking change would be I'm removing something, right? I've got a sales table, and I'm creating a new version of my model which no longer has a sales table, or where the sales table is called something else, right? That would be a breaking change because anyone who's created a report against that model may have some broken visuals in there, right? So that's basically the definition of breaking change here. Whereas what makes a minor version change is when I'm adding functionality, right? So specifically with respect to Power BI, a minor version change can never break a report, right? There's a new column or a new measure available or even a new table. Any existing report will work exactly as they have before, right? And a patch release does not change anything with respect to the feature set or with respect to functionality. It only fixes bugs, right? And so applying that principle to the example down here means compared to version 1.1, we added some new features. They were not breaking changes. And we must have had a bug in version 1.2.0, which is why 1.2.1 was then necessary as a patch release, right? So that's the gist of semantic versioning, and that's very well established. You know, it's not something I cooked up, or it's not a niche thing. That is very established in software and engineering circles. And again, from my point of view, it applies very well to Power BI artifacts as well. Okay, so let's look into the engineering side of things. So I've listed a few objectives or goals here in green, which you could also consider principles. Engineering-wise, what we care about is that our production system is guarded. You know, we can't have arbitrary changes in production without any visibility, without any auditing. Everyone has access to all versions, right? Also quite important. We know what's changed between versions. Developers get quick feedback, right? If you have a system where a developer is tasked to, I don't know, fix a particular measure because it doesn't return the right thing, and it would take them hours between deploying their fix and actually seeing whether or not it's done it, you have a problem, right? That's not something that scales nicely. A code repository should be the source of truth. We'll come to that in some more detail. And another one is developers should not have Power BI publish access. So that's could be controversial. It's definitely quite strict, but the idea is that publishing anything into a Power BI tenant, if you technically restrict that to only be possible via a service principal, and hence, if you technically restrict it to only be possible via a CI/CD system, via an automated deployment system, you've solved a lot of problems that you inherit if you allow people to arbitrarily push stuff into workspaces. Arguably, we don't have great tooling for that, and there's work to be done. But this is about, you know, thinking about what would be our desired state. Approval workflows, particularly in terms of keeping production guarded, right? And the ability to collaborate. Okay. A few tools which I just wanted to list out here. Again, this is not a technical session. This is really just a gathering of some themes and ideas and principles. But my toolbox looks like this. Power BI Desktop, frankly, even for model development, I personally still go back to Power BI Desktop a lot. Why? Because of the Power Query experience, right? But absolutely, there's no way to live without Tabular Editor when it comes to being serious about model development. There's no way to live without DAX Studio. For me, there's no way to live without PBI tools. Your choice. There is no way to live without Git, without VS Code, and most importantly, without a CI/CD server. Okay, so let's look at, so let's assume we are using a system where we're guarding production, where we don't just push stuff into production, but where we actually go through some stages, and where we're using source control. Looking at the pyramid on the left-hand side, those are 4 different environments: production, UAT, development, and local, which represent basically the funnel, if you will, of changes and where changes happen. So at the bottom of the pyramid, this is where most of the activity happens, but also where we have the least control, the least quality. At the top of the pyramid, there's the highest level of quality and very little activity, because we only change something in production again after quality checks and approvals and all of that have happened. So that's usually not every minute or so. And what works really well in a source control context is to actually map those environments to different branches in your Git system. So the model that's worked really well for me is to say the main branch, traditionally people also call that master, the main branch is by definition what's in production. That way the question I raised earlier is no longer even a question. If you want to know what's in production, just look at your main branch, right? You get there by ensuring that as soon as something changes in your main branch, your CI/CD server kicks off and actually pushes it into production, right? Again, if we use the proposed release model, which I talked about earlier, where we plan, to make certain increments as a new version, and where we know upfront what that version will be called, right? We're at 2.5 this month, we're going to 2.6 next month. We then have a dedicated 2.6 release branch, which we're continuously integrating into until 2.6 is ready to go into production, right? So, and that is something which we can also automate to actually push into UAT to be able to interact with our stakeholders. And in terms of what individual developers commit to, there are different branching models out there. This is where things get very granular. So if you work with an issue tracker where each particular feature has basically an issue number, you could use a model where you literally call it issue dash and then whatever the number is. Other models I've seen, particularly for bigger teams, is where you basically where you put somebody's initial into the branch name, and then it scales almost infinitely. Git has this nice concept where whenever you use a / it automatically considers that a hierarchy. So there we go. So that's a branching model, and what I usually do when setting up a new project is to create an environment matrix, just like that, where I literally spell out for that project what will my environments be, and what do I call them, which branch do they link to. How do I deploy into those respective environments? Basically, what's the trigger? And specifically, what is the Power BI workspace? And who has access? So just to look at an example here, if we're looking at the center column, UAT, we're basically saying UAT, in terms of source control, I consider anything that's in a release/number branch to be in a UAT environment. And I talked about that on the previous slide. And the trigger for something to go into the UAT environment would be that something was pushed into that respective release branch. So just to stay with the example, this month we're working on 2.6. We would then create a release/2.6 branch at the end of, at the beginning of the month. That would come off main to basically reflect what's currently in production. And then whenever any new features are signed off, they get pushed into that release branch, which would then push them into the UAT environment automatically. What is the UAT environment? That's what's defined down here. So in this case, just as an example, right? It would be the prod datasets workspace. However, any model that's being pushed has a suffix added to it which distinguishes it from the respective production version. So if the project we're working on is Contoso Sales, the Contoso Sales UAT dataset with respect to name is then considered the UAT version. Also, what I normally do and what works very nicely, anything that's development, anything that developers directly interact with uses PPU. That way it's kept out of my P1 or my P2 or whatever I'm using, and they can go wild there, and there's absolutely no danger that anything could ever impact my production capacity. And the other advantage we have is, and that's actually also quite neat, because other than my developers, no one has PPU licenses. There's no danger that something could ever leak into the business from a development environment, right? So we've got the guards in place, and we ensure that, you know, simply due to our system setup, stakeholders can only see, you know, from a licensing point of view, what's in UAT or production. Exactly, that's the point I'm making down here, right? So this is being shared with stakeholders, whereas this is internal only. And as I said in the beginning, literally sitting down, creating this matrix every time a new project kicks off, because you know, you may want to tweak things. You may have a dedicated UAT workspace, for instance, right? You may want to use a slightly different branching model, but it's definitely a very useful exercise. Okay, and then I'll skip that one because I've basically covered this already. So this was just talking about how we're using version releases and how we're linking, you know, from our issue tracker, which is the backlog and which contains our business specs, all the way into our source control system, which is obviously much closer to our engineers. There is a live example you can check out on GitHub, where I've got a very simple case illustrating all those concepts I've just explained. So we can see here, this is a pull request of changes which were merged into the 1.1 release branch. So that would make it the UAT environment, basically. The pull request was merging changes from the issues1-mt branch. So you can very easily figure out what that one relates to. It's basically our issue number 1, and MT, which happen to be my initials, owns that branch. And we can see we had 4 commits here. Commits have a description, and usually commits also have a reference to the respective issue. Again, this is an public open source example repo. You can check that one out offline. All right. I wanted to take this opportunity as well to mention one very recent change in the Power BI world that impacts or that will impact model development and enterprise model development in particular. We announced yesterday TIMDL, which is the tabular model definition language. And that is brand new, so literally just been around in terms of public awareness since yesterday. I want to mention it here because it addresses some of the issues that I've mentioned before and that the community has struggled with over quite a long time. So TIMDL is shipping as a new text-based format which allows us enterprise-grade source control on tabular models. It's fully Microsoft supported, and it will allow any external tool as well as internal Microsoft tools to use a consistent format that is completely interchangeable between different tools, and it's designed specifically for readability, for editability, and for collaboration. I'm going to give you a very brief example of that, just so you have an idea. I'm talking about this because I happen to be personally involved in that I actually contributed this to the product team as part of the contributor program. Yeah, I'm very biased with respect to how great this is, as you can imagine. And you will definitely hear a lot more about this moving forward. We haven't even had any sort of official announcements yet, apart from what we did at BITS yesterday. So there's more coming in the next few weeks. So just to give you a little glimpse here, we have a standardized folder structure which contains all the metadata defining models. This is very much inspired by what Tabular Editor invented some years ago, but also something which was Tabular Editor only. It was not a format that any other tool was able to understand or integrate with, let alone the Power BI stack itself. So the big change now is that this is coming straight from Microsoft, and we thought very hard, about the format that's being used. So even Tabular Editor today, if you use Save to Folder, uses a JSON format, which for many reasons is not actually ideal when it comes to using source control on models and particularly trying to collaborate on things. So that's why we have a completely new and different text-based representation, which looks like this. It's very readable, it's very, very concise, and it actually allows, to take this as an example, to embed snippets and expressions from other languages into our files. So this is an example of an M expression, which is part of my customer table, right? If you looked at the exact same equivalent in our traditional model, it would look something like this, right? So this is what we currently have. This is what we This is what we have even using tabular editor saved to folder. You can see there are lots of additional characters here. There are line breaks, there are escape characters. You cannot copy paste from here into another tool. This is Power Query, obviously the same applies to DAX. Whereas in the new world, that's arguably just beginning right now, you can do that, right? So just wanted to make you aware so that you've had a glimpse and that you've heard the term Timdal. It's early days, but there's a lot more coming here. All right. I've got a few more slides here, which I'm going to leave you to as offline study. That was always my intention for those in any case. Those are basically just a few specific tips and tricks. And I don't need to walk through all of those right now. I'd much rather take the opportunity to take some questions if we have any. By all means, use the QR code for feedback. Please do. And yeah, more than happy to look at, to go through any questions. Yeah, can we use the microphone?
I have a question about the Git.
Yes.
So when you have an issue, you create a dev or a dev branch, and you merge it into your release branch. Mm-hmm. But the business can first see the change in after it's been merged into the release branch. Mm-hmm. What if it turns out that this was not actually what business wanted? Yes,
very good point. So everyone understood the question, right? So the idea is that what's in your release branch is not final, it's not production. The release branch is basically where you're accumulating candidates for something that could ultimately end up in production, right? And so whilst you're in a sprint, whilst you're working to finalize the 2.6 version from the example, you would expect iterations. You would expect iterations even on specific changes, right? The point is, for this to get from the dev branch into release branch, you have an internal review first, right? But then to go for something to go from release into main, you need to engage with your stakeholder. They need to be involved. They need to give you feedback, yes or no. If they say no, it all goes back, right? And you'll have to reopen that issue and continue to push changes there.
What happens if you've reached the end of the month and there's one issue that business isn't happy with? Like you've already done a couple of
right, yes,
like,
good point. Again, this is where delivery comes in, right? So whoever's in charge of the release, they should not wait till the last day of the month to start engaging their stakeholders. You want to do this as early as possible, which is why we have a model where as soon as something has the internal sign-off, it goes into release branch. As soon as it's in a release branch, it ends up in the UAT environment. And at that point, you can engage. That could literally happen on the second day of the month, right? And that's really key, right? If you are in that position, and obviously, right, I mean, nothing is ever textbook, you have to make a choice. Delay or chuck it out and then put it into the next release.
Thank you.
All right, great session. Yes, slides will be shared. This complete set of M functions. Timdal is just a text format that contains everything in tabular model. Oh, right, okay. Is the complete set of M functions available in Timdal, or is there a difference between what's available in M as opposed to what's available in Timdal? The question does not apply, basically. So Timdal contains any valid M expression wherever an M expression is needed. Tyndall makes no assumptions with respect to what's valid or not valid in. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Tyndall is just an artifact for you to put stuff into the tabular model, right? The tabular model currently makes no assumptions with respect to expressions. You can put anything in there, right? It will then fail if you deploy it, and it doesn't happen to be valid. But that's not a Tyndall problem, right? That's a model development problem. Should I keep going on those? Right. Okay. Maybe one final question from the room.
I was just curious when you showed the table there and you showed the. I was just curious when you showed the table there and you showed the different data sources. One was on the line dev and UAT, and then you had the one for test. Do you have the same? I know it's the same data source. Is it the same number of rows and columns, or do you have a subset in each of those different environments?
Yeah, so this is one of the points I'm making here. I generally, for local development in particular, I heavily recommend to use filters to keep model size small, right? Because, you know, this is coming back to the point of quick feedback on the development side, right? You don't want to be in a position where a refresh of your development model on your machine takes minutes or hours, right? You want this to be very fast so that you can actually iterate. And so I haven't had an opportunity, obviously, to go into this in detail, but there are a few hyperlinks here. Once you have the slides, you can check out some examples from my GitHub, how to do that in practice.
Thank you.
All right, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it here. Maybe I should have allowed more time for question. By all means, do reach out, email me, or ping me on Twitter or LinkedIn if you have any other questions. Yeah, many thanks for that, and have a good journey home.